The rest stop arrest. It was just after 10 a.m. when Raymond Carter eased his black Lincoln Continental into the rest area off I-94, about 40 miles west of Lansing, Michigan. The morning sun glinted off the polished chrome of his car, its deep black paint gleaming like oil against the pavement. To any casual observer, it was just another quiet stop on a quiet stretch of highway. But to Raymond, it was a brief pause before what promised to be an important day. He wore a slate gray suit and a crisp, light blue dress shirt, professional, classic. His shoes were shined, his posture upright, and in the passenger seat rested a slim leather portfolio, holding briefing notes, printouts, and handwritten annotations for the governor's policy roundtable on justice reform, scheduled for noon. The irony of that, he would later reflect, was nearly unbearable. Raymond Carter had served as a district court judge for more than 2 decades. Known for his measured rulings, stern demeanor, and absolute fairness, he had quietly built a reputation across Michigan. His name carried weight in legal circles. His courtroom was orderly, respectful, and, as he insisted, equal for all. But none of that mattered when a white state trooper cruiser pulled into the rest area behind him, lights flashing. Inside, Officer Daniel Jeffers was already narrowing his eyes at the sight before him, a middle-aged black man, sitting alone in a high-end car, engine idling. To Jeffers, it wasn't just unusual. It was suspicious. Jeffers didn't hesitate. He picked up his radio and spoke sharply. Unit 14 to Unit 17, I've got a possible match on that vehicle description. Gas station theft report, westbound Interstate 94. I'm going in for contact. Backup advised. His partner, Officer Reich, responded that she was 5 minutes out. Raymond saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and let out a quiet sigh. He reached slowly toward the dashboard, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window halfway. His hands returned to the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread and visible. A practiced motion, one he had done before, more times than he could count. Jeffers approached the driver's side with the slow, firm steps of someone looking for trouble. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon. Raymond kept his eyes forward, calm but alert. "Good morning, officer," he said evenly, his tone smooth but not submissive. "Is everything all right?" Jeffers didn't respond right away. He took a long, obvious glance at the car's interior, then sized up Raymond, the expensive suit, the neat hair, the aged leather portfolio on the seat. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description seen leaving a gas station 20 minutes ago," he finally said, voice clipped and cold. Raymond blinked. "I'm not aware of any report like that," he said. "I just stopped for a few minutes before heading into Lansing. I can show you my registration and ID if you'd like." Jeffers didn't budge. Instead, he took a step back and barked, "Step out of the vehicle now." There was no courtesy in the tone, no explanation, just command. Raymond hesitated for the briefest of moments, not out of fear, but out of calculation. He had seen situations like this spiral for men who didn't take immediate compliance as their first move. And he wasn't about to become another statistic on a highway rest stop. He opened the door slowly, keeping his movements visible, deliberate. Standing up to his full 6-foot height, he turned and placed both hands at his sides, fingers slightly spread. As Jeffers approached, Officer Reich arrived. She moved in behind Jeffers, hand near her own weapon, her eyes darting between her partner and the black man now standing by the car. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of," Raymond said, voice still calm but firmer now. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Put your hands on the trunk," Jeffers snapped. Raymond obeyed, but his eyes flicked toward Reich, who was clearly unsure. Without asking, Jeffers moved to the car's open window and reached inside. He popped the glove compartment and began rummaging. Raymond straightened slightly. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," he said clearly. Jeffers turned, eyes sharp. "That's obstruction. You're interfering with an investigation." Before Raymond could reply, Jeffers grabbed his wrist, twisted his arm back, and slammed on a cold metal cuff. Reich, hesitating but compliant, moved in and secured the other wrist. Raymond didn't resist. He simply said, "You're making a serious mistake." A few travelers across the parking lot turned their heads at the commotion. One young woman, a college student on spring break, pulled out her phone and began recording. In the background, a retired veteran shook his head slowly and muttered under his breath, "That man doesn't look like someone who stole anything." But Jeffers and Reich weren't paying attention. They were too focused on walking Raymond to the back of the cruiser, as if he were someone dangerous, someone they had cornered. Yet even in handcuffs, Raymond's posture remained dignified. His head was held high, not in arrogance, but in disbelief. The kind that creeps in when you realize your credentials, your reputation, your whole career, can vanish in a single moment, just because of what someone sees when they look at you. As he sat in the back of the squad car, Raymond said nothing. He turned his gaze to the window, watching the trees blur past as they pulled onto the highway. He wasn't angry, not yet. But his mind was already moving, calculating, planning. Because what the officers didn't know, and what they would soon find out, was that Judge Raymond Carter wasn't just any man, and this would not end the way they thought. The cold chair. The state police precinct just outside Jackson, Michigan, smelled of institutional cleaner and stale coffee. Pale gray walls bore faded bulletin boards covered in curled notices no one read anymore. A radio squawked in the background. Phones rang. A printer clattered endlessly in the corner. Judge Raymond Carter sat in silence on a hard plastic chair just outside the booking area. His wrists were no longer cuffed, but the red marks they left remained, etched into his dark skin like a quiet indictment. He'd been sitting there for over 90 minutes. No charges had been explained. No phone call allowed. No one had addressed him by name. To the officers moving around him, he was just another middle-aged black man pulled in for something vague and forgettable. His calm demeanor didn't help. In fact, it made some of them more suspicious. Quiet men, in their experience, were often hiding something. Anger, guilt, something. The booking officer, a young man in his 20s, barely glanced up as he typed in Raymond's information. "Name?" he asked. "Raymond Carter," came the even reply. The officer keyed it in without comment, then gestured toward the waiting area. "Sit there. Someone will be with you." Raymond nodded once and took his seat again. He had asked, 3 times now, to call his office. He had calmly explained that he was scheduled to be in Lansing at noon, participating in a justice reform roundtable with the governor. Each time the response was the same. "In a minute," or "We'll see," or, more often, nothing at all. The hallway buzzed with movement. Uniformed officers came and went, laughing, checking screens, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups. A few passed by Raymond without so much as a glance. Others did glance, and then looked away, as if uncertain what to make of the man sitting so still, so composed, in a tailored suit. He didn't look like he belonged there. That much, everyone agreed. But none of them stopped to ask who he was. Officer Jeffers walked by more than once. Each time, he made brief, pointed eye contact with Raymond. Thinly veiled irritation sat in his face. His jaw clenched harder each time their eyes met. He didn't like the way Raymond looked at him. Not with fear, not with pleading, but with quiet knowing. It unnerved him. Officer Reich stayed mostly in the background. She kept her distance from Jeffers now, leaning against the wall near the evidence lockers. She seemed pale, uncomfortable. She hadn't said much since the arrest. Maybe she was replaying it in her mind. Maybe she wasn't. Raymond, for his part, said nothing. His silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. He knew the system, knew its rhythms. He had listened to stories like this from young black men in his courtroom for years. Men who'd been stopped, searched, silenced. Men who'd had no platform, no name, no camera. Now, it was happening to him. The symmetry of it all burned in his chest. Across the room, an officer muttered under his breath, not realizing Raymond could hear. "Thinks he's special, dressing like that?" Raymond didn't flinch. He simply waited. Finally, the shift supervisor stepped in. Sergeant Pamela Yates. Early 50s. Graying hair tucked neatly into a bun. Her uniform was sharp. Her eyes, sharper. She paused in the hallway and scanned the room. Then her gaze settled on Raymond. "How long's he been sitting here?" she asked, directing the question to no one in particular. "Almost 2 hours," someone replied. "Obstruction charge. Vehicle match." Yates frowned and walked over to Raymond. "Sir, have you been read your rights?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Raymond replied. "But I've not been permitted to call my office. I've asked several times." She studied him more closely now. Something in his voice, calm, controlled, unmistakably authoritative, made her pause. "What's your name again?" she asked. "Raymond Carter." Her brows lifted slightly. "Spell it for me?" He did. Her eyes narrowed. She stepped away, walking to a nearby computer terminal. A few keystrokes, then a pause. A longer pause. A moment later she blinked hard, leaned closer to the screen, then leaned back. Her body language changed. She double-checked the photo on file. It matched the man sitting calmly in her precinct. She turned her head slowly, looking back at Raymond. Then she stood abruptly and marched, toward the holding area. Officer Jeffers was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, wearing the same smug look he'd had since morning. Yates didn't waste time. "You said he was obstructing?" she asked. Jeffers straightened up. "Yes, ma'am. Didn't want us searching the vehicle. Gave me attitude. Claimed to be someone important." Yates shot him a sharp look. "Did you verify his ID?" "He didn't act like a judge," Jeffers muttered defensively. "Didn't say anything about a title." "You had his ID," she said, voice now cold steel. "It was your job to check it, not guess." She turned to Reich. "You cuffed him too?" Reich nodded slowly, eyes on the floor. Sergeant Yates turned, stepped back into the waiting area, and opened the door. "Mr. Carter, Judge Carter, I apologize. This should never have happened." Behind her, Jeffers froze. "Wait, Judge? What do you mean?" Yates turned toward him like a drawn blade. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You escalated without reason. You ignored protocol, denied him his right to counsel, and conducted an unlawful search." The silence in the room was thick. Even the radio had gone quiet. Jeffers opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Raymond stood slowly, straightened his coat. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I'd appreciate being allowed to call the governor's office now." "Of course, Your Honor," she said with a stiff nod. "Would you like a ride?" Raymond didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "Yes. Thank you." As he walked through the precinct, flanked by Sergeant Yates, officers who had ignored him now watched with uneasy eyes. Some looked embarrassed. Others avoided looking at him altogether. And the man they thought was nobody walked out with dignity fully intact. But no one in that building could forget what had happened. Because now, everyone knew exactly who he was. The video goes viral. By early evening, the internet had done what no press conference, protest, or politician could do. It lit a fire under the nation. The 27-second video had started like thousands of others. Shaky phone footage, a slightly muffled voice, cars in the background. But what set this one apart was its calm subject, a dignified black man in a gray suit, calmly asking why he was being arrested while 2 white officers handcuffed him against the back of a Lincoln Continental. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't resisting. And that, somehow, made it worse. "This is insane. He didn't do anything," the young woman filming could be heard saying. Her disbelief mirrored the emotion that millions would soon feel. The clip hit TikTok first. A college student from Chicago posted it with the caption, "Man arrested for being black, in a suit." It gained 600,000 views in 4 hours. Then it hit Twitter. Then Facebook. Then Instagram. Each share was faster than the last. Screenshots of the video were paired with another image, a professional headshot of Judge Raymond L. Carter from the 14th District Court of Michigan. The caption changed. "The man in cuffs. That's a sitting state judge." By midnight, the video had been viewed over 2.4 million times. The next morning, local news stations ran the story at the top of the hour. By mid-morning, National outlets picked it up. MSNBC, CNN, and even mainstream morning shows ran segments with phrases like mistaken identity, racial profiling, and constitutional violation. Screens everywhere showed a split frame. One side, the footage of Raymond's arrest. The other, his judicial profile with academic honors, legal appointments, and 22 years on the bench. A sharp contrast, and one that cut deep. Civil rights organizations reacted quickly. The Michigan Civil Liberties Alliance issued a statement calling for the immediate suspension of all officers involved and an independent investigation into racially motivated misconduct. The ACLU chimed in. Even the National Bar Association made noise, pointing out how chilling it was that someone so embedded in the justice system could be stripped of his dignity in seconds, on camera, with no legal recourse at the moment. Politicians began issuing public statements. Some were measured, others less so. A prominent state senator tweeted, "If this can happen to Judge Carter, imagine what happens to black men with no title at all." That tweet alone was shared 130,000 times. At the Jackson Police Precinct, meanwhile, the mood had shifted entirely. The precinct's previously buzzing hallways now felt colder, quieter. Officer Jeffers had been pulled into a closed-door meeting with internal affairs and the precinct captain. Officer Reich stayed mostly in the locker room, silent. Her usually chatty demeanor was gone. She hadn't spoken to Jeffers since that morning. Sergeant Pamela Yates sat at her desk fielding non-stop calls. The Attorney General's office, the governor's liaison, 3 different news networks. Everyone wanted a quote, a comment, or an update. She gave none. Not yet. The video had already made its way to every desktop in the precinct. Some officers watched it with pursed lips and furrowed brows. A few tried to justify it quietly. "We didn't have the full context," or "he should have identified himself earlier." But others, particularly the younger ones, didn't try to spin it. They saw it for what it was. Power, abused, dignity, denied, and justice, humiliated in its own name. Back at his home, Raymond Carter sat in a clean, modest living room with his wife Lillian. The news was on, though muted. A tablet buzzed on the table every few seconds. Calls, emails, messages from colleagues. Some personal, some official. He wasn't focused on any of it. He was quiet, sitting upright in an armchair, his eyes not tired, but watchful. His wife sat across from him, holding her tea tightly. "You didn't deserve this," she said softly. He didn't respond right away. After a few seconds, he looked up and said, "Neither did any of the men who came through my courtroom with the same story, and no one believed them." Lillian reached over and took his hand. "Now they do." He gave the faintest nod. The truth was, Raymond hadn't decided how he felt. He wasn't angry, not in the explosive, shouting way people expected. His anger ran deeper, older. It was forged over years of watching the cracks in a system he had tried so hard to hold together from the inside. But now the world had seen one crack too many. That evening, the governor's office issued a short but sharply worded press release. "We are reviewing the incident involving Judge Raymond L. Carter. Justice, equity, and the rule of law remain our highest priorities. We are committed to ensuring full transparency and accountability." It didn't say much, but it said enough. Outside the Jackson precinct, a group of protesters had gathered by dusk. It began with a few students holding signs. By 7 p.m., it had grown to nearly 50 people. Then 100. The signs read, "Judged before justice. Dignity in cuffs, not just a hashtag." Some people held candles. Others stood in silence. There were no chants, no shouting, just the weight of something long overdue. What disturbed the public most wasn't just that Judge Carter had been arrested. It was how quietly it happened. How professionally he had spoken, how still he remained. And how, even then, that wasn't enough to keep him safe. His calm composure, captured in 27 seconds of video, became a mirror. And millions of people saw themselves, or their brothers, or fathers, or sons, in that reflection. Inside the system, a shift had begun. Not loud, not declared, but undeniable. For once, the machine had arrested one of its own. And this time, it would not go unnoticed. The round table that changed everything. The rotunda of the Michigan State Capitol stood unusually silent that morning. The grand marble columns echoed with the faint shuffle of shoes, soft murmurs between staffers, and the distant whir of camera tripods being set up. Outside room 312, the designated venue for the Governor's Justice Reform Roundtable, a sea of reporters gathered behind red velvet ropes. Flashbulbs popped intermittently. Every eye was on the large oak double doors at the far end of the hallway. Inside the room, the governor's aides arranged place cards and water glasses. High-backed chairs encircled the gleaming mahogany conference table. Legal experts, state representatives, and policy advisors had already taken their seats. The governor himself stood near the podium, reviewing the talking points he would no longer get to use. Because the agenda had changed. Completely. Everyone was waiting for one man. At exactly 10 a.m., the doors opened. Judge Raymond Carter stepped inside. He wore a dark navy suit, immaculately pressed. The same leather portfolio from the day before was tucked under his arm. His posture was straight, his expression composed. He didn't need a security escort, a press officer, or a handler. He needed no introduction. A hush fell across the room. Not because protocol demanded silence, but because reverence did. As Raymond took his seat at the head of the table, the governor, seated directly across, stood and extended a hand. "Judge Carter," he said clearly, "we're honored to have you with us." Raymond nodded once, firmly. "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." No one needed to mention the video. No one needed to describe what had unfolded over the past 24 hours. Everyone already knew. What had been planned as a policy discussion on procedural standards now felt like something closer to a reckoning. Before the agenda could be formally introduced, Raymond raised a hand gently. The governor paused and gave a slight nod of approval. "If I may," Raymond began, his voice steady and clear. "I'd like to speak before we begin." Heads turned toward him. A few pens were set down. Cameras in the back of the room zoomed in silently. "Yesterday morning, on my way to this very meeting," Raymond said, "I was stopped, detained, and handcuffed by officers of our state police force. There was no warrant, no probable cause, no explanation beyond a vague suspicion tied, not to my behavior, but I believe to my appearance." He paused. No one moved. "The video speaks for itself," he continued. "But this is not just about me. I am not the first person this has happened to. And unless we act, I will not be the last." A few quiet nods spread around the table. A younger assemblywoman dabbed at the corner of her eye. Raymond's voice remained calm but firm. "We often speak of trust. Trust between the community and law enforcement. But let me be clear. Trust cannot exist without accountability. And dignity, especially the dignity of innocent people, cannot be optional." That sentence hung in the air like a bell note in a church tower. The governor leaned forward slightly. "Judge Carter," he said, "I believe your words reshape the purpose of this gathering. We no longer have the luxury of technical conversation. This is now a matter of urgency." A murmur of agreement circled the room. For the next hour, the discussion transformed. Video clips were replayed, not just of Raymond's arrest, but others. Lesser-known footage of unjust detainments, lawsuits buried in small courts, testimonies from victims who had never had a platform. Civil rights attorneys were brought into the room. Law professors and policy strategists joined via live feed. What had once been planned as a sterile review became a raw, open confrontation with the truth. Then came the moment no one had predicted. The governor's legal counsel leaned in to whisper something into his ear. After a brief exchange, the governor turned to the group and said, "I am authorizing an emergency review hearing into the conduct of Officers Jeffers and Reich. Effective immediately." There was a buzz of surprise. Then the governor looked directly at Raymond. "Your Honor, if you are willing, and if there is no ethical barrier, we would like you to oversee the session as a neutral authority. No one understands the stakes better than you." Raymond looked around the table. The room had gone very still. He thought for a moment. "Are you certain this is appropriate?" he asked, not out of fear, but out of integrity. The governor's counsel responded, "We've reviewed the code. You were the victim, but you are also the most qualified neutral party. This is not retaliation. This is restoration." Raymond took a breath. Then he gave a single nod. "Very well." 2 hours later, in the lower chamber of the Capitol, the hearing convened. Rows of state officials filled the gallery, alongside a limited number of civilians who had secured access passes, including students, lawyers, and at least 2 of the protesters from the night before. Reporters packed the corners, mics ready. The atmosphere was tense, but respectful. At the front of the room sat Judge Raymond Carter, flanked by 2 fellow judges and the state attorney. His presence brought a weight few had expected. Then the doors opened again. Officers Jeffers and Reich entered. They looked different now, stripped of arrogance. Jeffers' face was pale, his eyes darting toward the floor. Reich moved slowly, her expression unreadable. The hearing was not about vengeance. Raymond had made that clear from the beginning. "We are not here to relive public embarrassment," he said. "We are here to evaluate conduct and determine whether the actions taken violated both legal standards and human decency." Body camera footage was reviewed, witness statements read, department logs presented. It became clear, disturbingly clear, that neither officer had run a proper ID check before detainment. Their written reports contradicted timestamps from their own dashboard cams. When asked directly, Reich admitted she had not reviewed Raymond's license at the scene. She stared at the table when she spoke. Jeffers attempted to defend himself by citing departmental discretion, but his answers faltered under questioning. Through it all, Raymond remained measured, professional, controlled. But his tone carried a finality that said this: "The time for excuses is over." By 5:12 p.m., the review panel adjourned for deliberation. The room emptied slowly, the silence heavy with implication. And in every hallway, behind every closed door of the Capitol, one question echoed louder than ever before. What happens when the system finally looks inward and listens? The reckoning. By the time the hearing reconvened, dusk had begun to fall over the Capitol. Long shadows crept across the polished marble floor as the courtroom lights flickered back on. Reporters had returned to their seats, pens poised. The public gallery, still tightly packed, had quieted to an expectant hush. Judge Raymond Carter sat once more at the center of the panel, flanked by Judge Renata Holloway and Judge Marcus Eddings, both known across the state for their integrity and no-nonsense approach. To Raymond's right sat the State Attorney General's representative, folder open, eyes narrowed. The chamber doors opened again. Officers Jeffers and Reich entered quietly. Gone were their confident strides. Gone, too, was the certainty that often cloaks law enforcement in proceedings like these. They looked like 2 people who knew the tide had shifted. They took their places before the panel. Raymond leaned forward, folding his hands on the bench. "We have reviewed all submitted evidence, including body camera footage, dashcam timestamps, witness statements, booking records, and officer testimony. This panel now delivers its findings." The room held its breath. "The evidence shows," Raymond began, voice even but commanding, "that Officer Jeffers initiated a traffic stop based on an unverified suspicion. No license plate match was confirmed. No warrant was issued. The suspect, myself, was fully cooperative." He paused, letting the weight of his own presence and experience underline each word. "Despite this," he continued, "the suspect was ordered out of his vehicle at gunpoint, handcuffed, and subjected to a warrantless search. When asked multiple times to contact legal representation, those rights were denied." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Raymond turned to the second page of the report. Furthermore, Officer Reich failed to conduct proper verification of identity, despite being present and able to intervene. Written reports from both officers contradict digital logs and video evidence. He looked up now, directly at the 2 officers. "You did not just detain a judge. You profiled a man in a suit, a citizen, a human being. Your failure was not only procedural, it was moral." Jeffers' jaw twitched. Reich looked down again, Judge Holloway spoke next. This panel finds both officers to have committed gross negligence in the performance of their duties, with specific violations of constitutional protections regarding unlawful search and seizure, abuse of discretion, and denial of counsel. Judge Eddings followed, his tone hard. These actions demonstrate a disregard for departmental protocol and public trust. Your behavior exposed this state, and the badge you wear, to public shame and legal liability. Then Raymond spoke the final words. As such, we unanimously recommend that Officers Jeffers and Reich be immediately suspended without pay pending full disciplinary proceedings by the State Attorney General's office. You could have heard a pin drop. The official language was clear and deliberate. A misuse of authority grounded in personal bias and a dangerous lapse in professional judgment. The silence following the decision was more powerful than any applause could have been. Even the reporters paused before scribbling their notes, as if the air itself had shifted. Jeffers didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on a knot in the wood table, his hands clenched just out of sight. Reich nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth that had been buried inside her for too long. When the officers were dismissed, they stood, turned, and exited with a stillness that felt less like dignity and more like surrender. Protesters who had waited outside all day stood aside as the doors opened. There was no shouting, no triumph, just silence. The kind of silence that lingers when truth has been spoken and heard. A few hours later, the governor stood behind a podium set against the Capitol's west steps. The flags behind him stirred gently in the night wind. Floodlights lit the crowd of reporters, staffers, and community leaders standing below. Raymond Carter stood beside him, not behind him, not off to the side, but shoulder to shoulder. Today, the governor said, was not about revenge. It was about responsibility. His voice was steady, solemn. Judge Raymond Carter demonstrated not only restraint, but the kind of leadership every public servant should aspire to. His conduct reminded us all that power need not be loud to be strong, and that justice, when served rightly, humbles even the most protected systems. Then came the announcement. Effective immediately, the governor would sign an executive order to introduce a mandatory statewide training program for all law enforcement agencies. The program would focus on de-escalation techniques, racial bias recognition, constitutional rights in field operations, crisis response involving public officials and civilians alike. In addition, the governor proposed an independent oversight committee, a civilian review body with legal power to investigate complaints of misconduct across all 83 Michigan counties. Raymond stepped to the podium. His presence was calm, as always, but the emotion under the surface was more visible now. The restraint was still there, but so was the purpose. What happened to me happens to people every day, he said, scanning the crowd. The only difference is, this time there was a camera, a name, a platform. He let that truth settle. But make no mistake, he continued, this story is not mine alone. It belongs to the father driving home from work, the college student walking to class, the young man waiting at a bus stop. People stopped not because of what they've done, but because of who they are seen to be. He closed his remarks with a quiet conviction. Wounds like these do not heal in silence. They require truth, they require light, and they require accountability. Let this be the beginning. The press didn't shout questions. They simply stood and watched, because somehow, in a city full of speeches, this one actually meant something. Back at home that evening, Raymond sat in his study. The house was quiet. Lillian brought in a cup of tea and set it on the table beside him. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the darkness settle in over the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on. The sound of distant traffic hummed beneath it all. He wasn't thinking about Jeffers or Reich. He wasn't thinking about the governor or the cameras. He was thinking about all the young black men whose cases had crossed his courtroom over the years. How many times had he heard their voices tremble while describing stops like his? How many times had their stories been doubted? And now, maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. Ripples through the system. 3 days after the Capitol hearing, change no longer felt like a buzzword. It felt like motion. It began with phones ringing off the hook at precincts across the state. Not from media this time, but from citizens, Black, white, Latino, Asian, young and old, asking questions that, until now, had been swallowed by silence. Can I request footage of my arrest? Who oversees officer conduct in this department? Where do I file a complaint about racial profiling? For many departments, these weren't normal questions, not because they hadn't been asked before, but because they'd rarely been answered. But now, after that video, after that hearing, after that judge, they had to be. In Jackson, Lansing, Flint, and Detroit, command staff began holding closed-door meetings, some defensive, some constructive. But the urgency was undeniable. The system had been exposed, and now it had to respond. In one suburban precinct outside Grand Rapids, a sergeant gathered his patrol unit and rolled a projector to the front of the room. He played the Carter arrest video. No one spoke. When it ended, he said, "I want every one of you to tell me what should have gone differently, and I want you to tell the truth." For once, no one rolled their eyes. No one scoffed. Because this time, it wasn't them versus the world. It was them versus their reflection. Meanwhile, the newly announced Independent Oversight Committee began operations from a temporary office in Lansing. Civil rights lawyers, retired judges, and appointed community members staffed the initial board. One of their first tasks, review the entire 3-year record of officers Jeffers and Reich. It didn't take long to find patterns. Jeffers had made 19 stops in the past year that involved young black men and probable cause traffic violations. Yet not a single citation had been filed. His body cam footage for 7 of those stops was incomplete. Notes from 2 internal complaints, both filed by citizens, had been closed without explanation. As news of these findings surfaced, a subtle but important shift happened within the justice system itself. Judges began to look more closely at police statements. Public defenders requested more full disclosures. City councils asked questions they'd avoided for years. And in communities long dismissed as low-trust zones, town halls began popping up, not staged or ceremonial, but real. One such meeting, held at a community center in Saginaw, filled to capacity in under 30 minutes. The flyer simply said, "Let's talk about the badge and what it should protect." Inside, people took turns. A former inmate, a high school teacher, a mother who hadn't seen justice for her son's stop-and-search case. They spoke not just about fear, but about fatigue, about dignity, about the idea that they could still belong in a system that had often treated them like shadows. Back in Lansing, the governor's office was flooded with messages, not just outrage, but solutions. One came from a small-town police chief who wrote, "We don't need another press release. We need listening sessions inside the department, and we need someone like Judge Carter to show us how to hold a mirror up without breaking it." And then, quietly, a proposal landed on Raymond's desk. Not an offer for a book deal, not a media tour, but something different. An invitation from the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy. They were restructuring their curriculum, the first overhaul in 2 decades. And they wanted him, not as a guest of honor, but as a keynote speaker for the first graduating class trained under the new bias awareness and community respect standards. At first, Raymond declined, politely but firmly. He had no appetite for attention. He hadn't set out to become a symbol. All he'd ever wanted was to interpret the law with fairness, not become the reason it was rewritten. But then he received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. In uneven handwriting it read, "My name is Marcus. I'm 17. I used to think the police could do whatever they wanted. Then I saw your video. You made me believe maybe not all of them get away with it. Thank you." Raymond read the note 3 times. He didn't show it to anyone, not even Lillian. But the next morning, he called the academy and said simply, "I'll do it." The news was quietly released. No press conference, no cameras. But within law enforcement circles, it echoed like a warning bell and a promise rolled into one. Back at the Jackson precinct, officers Jeffers and Reich were officially placed on extended administrative leave. The announcement was met with a mixture of anger, relief, and fatigue. Jeffers didn't speak to the press. but an anonymous source inside the department confirmed that he'd begun consulting an attorney. Rumors of pending civil suits swirled quietly through legal circles. Reich, on the other hand, had made a different choice. She submitted a written statement to the Oversight Committee, voluntarily admitting her failure to verify identity and her passive compliance during the arrest. In it, she wrote, "I saw the wrong thing happening and didn't stop it. I will carry that with me, but I also hope to learn from it. I am requesting reassignment to non-patrol duties while I seek counseling and complete retraining." The committee released that statement to the public. It didn't make her a hero, but it made her human. That gesture, rare in law enforcement, drew mixed reactions. Some said she was saving herself. Others said, maybe, she was starting to understand. And as for Judge Raymond Carter, he never mentioned the arrest in his courtroom. He never changed his tone or quoted his own case in arguments. But something was different. Attorneys, defendants, and even law enforcement officers entering his courtroom carried a new awareness. They looked twice. They stood straighter. They understood, in a way they hadn't before, that the man behind the bench wasn't just a judge. He was a reminder, a symbol of what happens when a system forgets who it's meant to serve, and what happens when someone inside that system decides, enough is enough. The steps of change. It was a bright spring afternoon when Judge Raymond Carter stepped onto the wide stone steps of the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy. The sky above was clear, almost defiantly so, and a soft breeze stirred the line of state flags that flanked the long front walkway. The building, once seen as a symbol of rigidity and control, now carried a different weight, one of cautious hope. Raymond adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit, not out of vanity but habit. A small lapel pin, a set of balanced scales, glinted in the sunlight. Ahead of him, in neat formation, stood 52 cadets, young men and women in fresh uniforms, their shoulders squared, their eyes locked forward. This was the first graduating class trained under Michigan's new Bias Awareness and Constitutional Accountability program, a reform sparked directly by his own experience. The reforms had been fought, of course. Some departments resisted. Some senior officers scoffed. But public pressure, paired with sweeping political support, had pushed it through. And now, these cadets, many barely out of college, were the first to carry its mark. Raymond had turned down almost every public appearance in the months since the hearing. He didn't want to be paraded as a symbol. He didn't want to give sound bites. But this invitation felt different. It wasn't about optics. It was about planting something new. The Academy's director, a stern woman named Lieutenant Colleen Braddock, stood at the podium and gave a brief, respectful introduction. Her words were formal, but her eyes held something softer. "And now," she said, "it is my distinct honor to welcome to this stage a man whose strength reminded us all what justice should look like, even in silence. Please welcome the Honorable Judge Raymond Carter." A smattering of applause followed. Not loud, not performative, just sincere. Raymond stepped forward and took his place behind the microphone. He scanned the sea of cadets before him, young, diverse, expectant, and for once, maybe, listening. He began simply. 3 months ago, he said, I stood on the other side of a badge. No PowerPoint, no notes, just his voice. I wasn't a judge that day. I wasn't even a man, not in their eyes. I was a risk, a profile, a target. The cadet stood completely still, not rigidly, but purposefully. That experience could have made me bitter, Raymond continued. But instead, it made me more committed. Not to punishment, he paused, but to purpose. He let that word linger, then leaned in, just slightly. You are not here just to enforce laws, he said. You are here to protect dignity. And that begins, not when you draw your weapon, but when you decide what someone's face means before they ever speak. Some cadets blinked hard, others shifted slightly, not in discomfort, but realization. You will walk into neighborhoods that do not trust you, Raymond said. Not because they are criminals, but because they've been bruised, over and over by uniforms that look just like yours. He took a slow breath. You cannot control what's been done before you, but you can control what is done through you. A few heads nodded now. You're going to be tested by heat, by fear, by someone who reminds you of a face you saw on the news. In that moment, you will either act from your training or your bias. He paused again. Let it sit. One will keep someone alive. The other will destroy everything. Behind him, Lieutenant Braddock stood with her hands folded. No smile, just gravity. Raymond looked out at the cadets and softened his tone. I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because someone needs to say the thing we always avoid saying in these ceremonies. He stepped out slightly from behind the podium. This uniform doesn't make you a protector. The breeze stirred again. Your decisions do. One cadet, black about 21, held his gaze just a second longer than the rest. Raymond saw it. He registered it, and he let it be. He concluded with no fanfare. I won't wish you luck, he said. I'll wish you clarity, because every person you stop, every door you knock on, every life you touch, will either leave with trust or with a scar. With that, he nodded and stepped back. The cadets didn't erupt in applause. They didn't need to. The silence afterward spoke louder than any cheer. After the ceremony, families rushed in from the wings of the field, embracing their sons and daughters. Proud parents wiped away tears. Photos were snapped. Laughter floated in the air. Raymond stood off to the side, hands folded behind his back, quietly watching. The young black cadet who had held his gaze earlier approached. Sir, he said simply. Thank you. Raymond gave a single slow nod. Serve with honor. The cadet saluted. Not out of duty, out of meaning. As the crowd thinned, the press tried to approach Raymond. He politely declined every interview. One reporter, more persistent than the rest, called out, Judge Carter, do you think this changes anything? Raymond stopped for a moment, turned slightly. Ask me again, he said. In 10 years. Then he walked down the stone steps alone, the echo of polished shoes fading into the spring breeze. He wasn't thinking about Jeffers or Reich anymore. He wasn't thinking about the video, the headlines, or even the hearing. He was thinking about Marcus, the boy who had written to him, and the hundreds of young men like him who had been silenced long before they ever had a chance to be heard. This wasn't a victory. It was a seed. And seeds don't roar when they grow. They root. They stretch. They push through hardened ground, 1 inch at a time. Raymond Carter didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want his name etched in headlines. He just wanted to make sure the next time someone like him sat behind the wheel of a nice car on a quiet highway, headed to a meeting they earned, they'd make it there, without fear, without cuffs, without a camera to prove their worth. And maybe, just maybe, that road was finally being paved. The foundation we build. 3 months to the day since his arrest, Judge Raymond Carter stood outside his courthouse in downtown Lansing, the same building where he had presided over thousands of cases, rendered hundreds of rulings, and delivered justice with a steady, unswerving hand. Today, however, he wasn't in his robe. There was no gavel, no bench, just him, standing on the stone steps as golden afternoon light warmed the marble columns behind him. He looked down at the crowd gathering below, not for a protest, not for a trial, but for something different, something quieter, something lasting. The Justice Equity Initiative was officially launching. A statewide alliance of legal professionals, law enforcement leaders, civil rights advocates, and community representatives. The mission was bold but simple: to make Michigan a model of accountable policing and equitable justice through education, oversight, and lived experience. What had begun as an act of humiliation was now shaping policy and shifting culture. Raymond hadn't asked to lead it, but the truth was, everyone kept looking to him anyway. Your Honor, someone called softly from the side. It was Jennifer Keene, a public defender and one of the founding members of the initiative. They're ready. Raymond gave a small nod. He took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. He didn't bring a speech. That had never been his way. He just spoke. 3 months ago, I was mistaken for a criminal, he began, his voice calm but resolute. Not because of what I said, Not because of what I did, but because of what I looked like. In a suit at a rest stop. A few people nodded. Some in the front rows had heard this story a dozen times already. But each time, it felt newly sharp. I was silenced, cuffed, ignored. Not by a system that was broken, but by a system that was working exactly as it was allowed to. He paused, letting that land. We often talk about fixing what's broken, he said, his tone rising just slightly. But what if it's not broken? What if it was built this way from the start, to favor some and make others explain their right to breathe, to stand, to drive, to be? A soft wind moved through the trees nearby. A flag flapped overhead. I don't stand here to relive what happened. I stand here to make sure it doesn't keep happening. Not just to men in suits, but to teenagers in hoodies, to mothers in minivans, to workers heading home after a long shift. He looked out at the faces before him. Some hopeful, some weary, some skeptical. We cannot legislate dignity, but we can protect it. With policies, with training, with accountability that doesn't wait until a video goes viral. He drew a slow breath. And when I look out at all of you, I don't see protesters. I don't see politicians. I see builders, brick by brick, one reform at a time. The crowd clapped, not loudly, but with the kind of gravity that says, "We understand." As Raymond stepped away from the podium, a man in a gray flannel shirt approached him slowly. He looked to be in his late 60s, hair graying at the temples. A faded army tattoo peeked out from under his sleeve. "You don't remember me," he said quietly. "But I saw what happened that day, at the rest stop. I was the guy with the thermos. I told the girl to start recording." Raymond studied his face. It came back to him like a photograph. The man standing beside his pickup truck, eyes full of silent disapproval as Raymond was cuffed. "I just wanted you to know," the man continued, voice rough with emotion. "I didn't know who you were, but I knew it was wrong. And I've been telling people ever since." Raymond reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you for seeing what others wouldn't." The man nodded, cleared his throat, and stepped back into the crowd. Across the street, a mural had gone up in the weeks since the hearings. It wasn't flashy. No bold slogans, no fists raised in the air. Just an image of a courtroom bench. Empty. Sunlight spilled through its windows, casting shadows on the floor. Below it were words in small, white script. "Justice doesn't begin at the verdict. It begins at the stop. R.C." No one asked Raymond if the quote was really his. They didn't need to. He walked back up the courthouse steps alone, the crowd slowly dispersing behind him. Inside, his chambers were as they had always been. Organized, quiet, filled with well-worn legal volumes and framed photographs. One in particular stood out on the bookshelf now. A picture of the 2025 cadet graduating class, with Raymond standing beside the group. A hand resting on the shoulder of one black cadet, who had thanked him with the words, "Go serve, with honor." Raymond sat at his desk and glanced at the stack of pending cases. The world outside had changed. But the work, the slow, meticulous work of applying justice, remained. He picked up the top file and opened it. As he read, he heard a notification buzz on his phone. He didn't check it. He didn't need to. The news could wait. Because justice, real justice, wasn't built on trending hashtags or flashbulbs. It was built in moments. Quiet, unseen moments. Like an officer hesitating before profiling. Like a sergeant speaking up instead of looking away. Like a cadet remembering a story before drawing their weapon. Like a judge, sitting alone in his chambers, reading every word, and making sure it's fair. That evening, Raymond walked out of the courthouse and stood beneath the early evening sky. The sun was low, the breeze warm. Cars passed. People walked dogs. A young man on a bike waved. Raymond nodded. It was an ordinary evening, and somehow that felt extraordinary. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't seeking headlines or handshakes. What he felt now was something different, something sturdier, resolve. Change wouldn't come fast. Not everywhere. Not for everyone. But it had started. And if it could start with handcuffs on a quiet highway, it could start anywhere. One choice. One officer. One moment of restraint. One act of decency. One courtroom at a time. As the courthouse doors closed behind him for the night, Raymond Carter understood something with absolute clarity. Justice isn't carved into stone. It's carved into the decisions we make when no one's watching. And those are the choices that last.